Tom's day had begun like any other. As dawn broke, he awoke to the gentle thud of Bailey's tail against the floor beside his bed. Her warm presence a daily comfort. She was already eager for their morning walk, eyes shining, her loyal gaze greeting him as it had every day since he'd brought her home. In the quiet morning, nothing hinted at the darkness that would soon cast a shadow over their lives. To Tom, Bailey wasn't just a dog. She was family, his steadfast companion after grueling hours in the bustling auto shop downtown. Her eyes, always brimming with love, brought him the strength he needed to get through each day. Every evening when he returned home, there she was, joyously bouncing to meet him at the door. But tonight would be heartbreakingly different. As Tom drove home that evening, he smiled, thinking of the steak he had picked up as a treat for Bailey. He could almost see her ecstatic reaction, practically leaping with joy when she'd catch the scent from the kitchen. Bailey was playful, fiercely loyal, and above all, protective. No matter how late he came home, she was always there to welcome him, her joy filling every corner of the room. But as Tom turned into the driveway tonight, an unsettling quiet blanketed the house. Usually, Bailey would already be waiting at the window or poised by the door, eager for his arrival. Tonight, however, there was only silence. Unease settled in his chest, a faint alarm growing stronger as he stepped out of the truck. He approached the front door, noting with a pang of dread that it was ajar. Tom never left the door unlocked, not even for a quick trip down the street. Heart pounding, he gently nudged it open and stepped inside, his breath catching in his throat. The living room, once a haven of warmth and order, was now in disarray. The couch lay overturned, its cushions torn open, stuffing scattered across the floor. The coffee table was on its side, one leg snapped off, and the familiar frames on the wall lay shattered on the ground. The coffee table lay on its side, one leg snapped clean off, while shattered glass from family photos crunched under Tom's boots as he took a careful, heart-pounding step forward. The curtains, usually drawn neatly at the window, had been ripped from their rods, tangled in messy heaps across the floor. Books and magazines were strewn everywhere, pages shredded as if by a savage force. Tom's first desperate thought was a break-in, maybe a robbery, but nothing about this felt right. This chaos was too frenzied, too ruthless. Less about theft, more about tearing apart the very heart of his home. Bailey! Tom's voice cracked as he called out, his heart swelling with fear. Silence. No skittering paws, no excited bark. Just an unnatural, crushing stillness. Panic seized his chest as he pushed further into the wreckage, desperate to find her. The kitchen was no better. Cabinets swung open, pots and pans littered the floor, and the fridge door hung ajar, its contents scattered amidst the growing disarray. Tom's breath quickened, each beat of his heart a dreadful echo. Where was Bailey? Then his foot slipped on something slick and he nearly fell. He glanced down and his heart froze. Blood, dark, crimson smears across the floor, leading in a grisly trail back toward the living room. Bailey! He cried, more desperately this time, his voice thick with dread as he followed the trail, his legs moving almost of their own accord. He rounded the corner, and there she was, her familiar form lying near the kitchen entrance. Tom's breath hitched. In horror, he dropped to his knees at her side, eyes wide with disbelief. Bailey lay motionless, her tan fur matted with blood, deep gashes scoring her body. Her breaths were shallow, labored, each one a painful rasp that pierced his heart. Bailey, oh God! No, please, hang on, Tom whispered, his voice breaking, his hand trembling as he gently touched her head. Bailey's eyes fluttered open weakly, the spark of life that had always brightened them now dimmed with agony. She let out a low, feeble whine, barely able to move. Tom's hands hovered over her wounds, helpless, horrified, and desperate to ease her pain. The cuts ran deep, too deep, as if something with claws had savagely torn through her flesh. Tom's mind raced, frantic to make sense of it. What could have done this? An animal? But no, Bailey was strong, fierce. No ordinary animal could have brought her down like this. Bailey was no ordinary dog. She was strong, fiercely protective, too powerful to be bested by a typical animal. Tom's mind raced with the possibilities. If this had been a person, where were they now? His gaze swept over the room again, his breaths ragged and uneven, each one steeped in rising dread. This wasn't just a break-in. There was no evidence of theft, only utter, senseless destruction. Then his eyes fell on the floor. Deep, jagged scratches ran from the kitchen to the spot where Bailey lay. These gouges were massive, violent, not something his dog could have made. No, these looked like they were carved by something monstrous. A shiver raced up Tom's spine as fear gripped his heart. What on earth had happened here? Who or what could have done this? Then he heard it. A low, rumbling growl, vibrating through the air with a menacing resonance. It seemed to come from deep within the house, darker and more foreboding than anything Bailey could have produced. Tom's blood ran cold, and an instinctive voice in his head screamed at him to flee, to leave the house, to call for help. But another, fierce need to protect, to stand his ground, drove him forward, overriding every rational urge to escape. Without thinking, he grabbed a nearby lamp, clutching it like a weapon, and crept toward the hallway. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat loud in his ears as he stepped deeper into the darkness. The growling grew louder, closer, reverberating through the silent house. Shadows blanketed the corridor ahead, stretching long and foreboding. Tom squinted, trying to peer through the darkness, his grip tightening on the lamp until his knuckles turned white. Then, at the far end of the hallway, near the doorway to his bedroom, he saw movement. Something or someone was there. But as his eyes adjusted, his breath caught in his throat. Whatever it was too large to be a person, and its shape was disturbingly wrong. It dragged itself forward in jerky, unnatural motions, its heavy form scraping against the floor. And then he saw them, two faint, eerie pinpricks of light, glowing in the darkness like sinister eyes, unblinking and fixed directly on him. The creature shifted, its massive form inching forward, revealing itself from the shadows in a twisted, unnatural shape that sent a chill of terror through Tom's entire body. The creature lurked in the shadows, covered in matted, dark fur. Its body twisted and hunched in an unnatural way. Tom's heart pounded violently in his ears as he tried to make sense of the grotesque figure before him. But then, with a sickening realization, he noticed something that stopped his heart. Something horribly familiar. Around the creature's neck was a collar. A worn leather collar he knew all too well. It was Bailey's. "Down," the man commanded, his voice sharp and unyielding. The creature let out a guttural snarl but obeyed, slowly lowering itself to the floor. Tom, still in shock, his chest heaving, could only stare in disbelief. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice trembling as he tried to grasp the nightmare unfolding before him. The man didn't spare him a glance. His attention remained fixed on the creature now lying obediently at his feet. "You weren't supposed to see this," he said flatly, his tone devoid of any emotion. "See what?" Tom's voice cracked, a mix of terror and anger swelling within him. "What did you do to Bailey?" At last, the man turned, his cold gaze meeting Tom's, his expression unreadable. "It's not what I did," he replied, a chilling calm in his voice. "It's what you allowed to happen." Tom stared at him, his mind racing. "What are you talking about?" The man sighed, as if he were explaining something painfully obvious. "Bailey was chosen. She was the perfect host," he said. "But now this. The experiment is over," the man continued, his words heavy and final. Tom's stomach turned with a rising, unbearable dread as he looked into the man's eyes, cold and piercing. The man offered a chilling smile. "For something far beyond your comprehension," he said, his tone unervingly calm. "But don't worry, you'll never have to deal with it again." Without another word, the man pressed a button on the device in his hand, and instantly, the creature that had once been Bailey let out a final, agonized snarl before collapsing onto the floor. Her body convulsed violently, a twisted echo of life that quickly stilled. Silence followed, a suffocating, deafening silence that filled the hallway as Tom stood frozen, his heart thundering in his chest, his mind unable to grasp what had just happened. His Bailey, his loyal companion, his friend, now lay lifeless at his feet. Her once bright, loving eyes had turned dull, vacant, stripped of all the warmth they once held. Trembling, Tom took a tentative step forward, his entire body trembling as he struggled to process the terrible sight before him. The man remained standing, his gaze coldly fixed on Bailey's lifeless form, the faint glow of the device casting an eerie light over her still body. "Bailey?" Tom whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his grief. Kneeling beside her, he reached out, his hand trembling as it met her fur, now chilled, devoid of the familiar warmth that had always comforted him. The deep wounds and gashes that had torn through her body remained, but now they seemed hollow, like remnants of a cruel and twisted end. Why did this happen?" Tom finally managed to say, his voice thick with anguish. He turned to the man, his eyes pleading, desperate for any kind of answer. "What did you do to her? What was that thing?" The man's expression remained indifferent, though a flicker of something like annoyance passed through his gaze, as if Tom's confusion was an inconvenience. "I told you Bailey was chosen, a perfect host for the experiment," he replied, his tone dismissive, almost clinical. "But it seems the integration was less than ideal." Tom's mind whirled, racing to make sense of the man's words. Integration, experiment, his grief and fury churned within him, struggling to break free. "What kind of experiment?" Tom demanded, his voice cracking with anger and despair. "Who are you?" The man's eyes darkened, his face hardening as he took a step closer, his tone growing colder and more menacing. "You wouldn't understand," the man replied, his tone cold and dismissive. "But suffice it to say, you and your dog were part of something much larger, something that demands certain sacrifices." His eyes flickered toward Bailey's lifeless body, lying unnaturally still. "It's unfortunate, really." She showed great promise. "But not every plan goes the way it's supposed to." Tom's blood surged with rage, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. "You used her," he spat, his voice quivering with fury. "You turned her into this, a monster. Who gave you the right?" But the man only raised an eyebrow, unfazed by Tom's outburst. "She was an asset, a tool, if you will," he said coolly. "And now that tool is no longer useful." Tom's fists clenched, the grief and anger inside him building to an overwhelming ache. "She wasn't a tool," he growled, his voice thick with sorrow. "She was my dog, my family." The man's lips curled into a cold, humorless smile, as though he found Tom's words amusing. "Family? You're mistaken," he scoffed. "Bailey was never just a dog. From the moment you took her home, she was chosen, for a purpose far beyond your little suburban life." Tom's mind raced back to the day he had adopted Bailey. She had been just a puppy, full of boundless energy and joy. He remembered the way she stood out, how she seemed to understand him in ways no other dog could. But now, staring into the calculating eyes of this stranger in his shattered home, Tom felt a chilling realization sink in. Something had always been different about her, hadn't it? "Chosen?" he whispered, barely able to process the word. "For what?" The man's gaze turned darker, his voice lowering to an almost menacing calm. "For something you'll never fully comprehend," he replied coldly. "But it doesn't matter now. The experiment is over. Bailey is no longer of use to us." Tom's heart splintered as he looked down at Bailey's lifeless form, his loyal companion, his protector, his friend, gone. But what tore at him most was knowing that she hadn't died naturally. Her life had been taken, twisted into something unrecognizable, stripped of everything he had loved about her. You did this," Tom whispered, his voice thick with grief. "You took her from me." The man didn't deny it, his expression impassive as he met Tom's tear-filled gaze. "It was necessary," he said, his tone calm, "for the greater good." Tom's voice rose, laced with disbelief and raw anger. The greater good? What kind of greater good turns a living, breathing creature into a monster? The man's expression hardened, his eyes as cold and unyielding as stone. The kind of greater good that will save far more lives than you could possibly imagine. Tom shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. I don't care about your so-called greater good, he said, his voice breaking. I care about Bailey. She didn't deserve this. The man took a step forward, his presence looming larger as he prepared to respond. The man's presence loomed larger as he stepped closer, his gaze cold and unyielding. Deserve? This was never about what Bailey deserved. He sneered, his voice devoid of any remorse. This was about what was required. And now the experiment is over. Tom looked up at him, fury and anguish battling in his chest. So that's it? He demanded, his voice trembling. You take everything from me, destroy everything I love, and you just walk away? The man tilted his head, an expression of mild interest crossing his face, as though Tom were a mere inconvenience. What's left for you here, Tom? He replied with a mocking calm. Bailey is gone, your home is in ruins. There's nothing left to discuss. A surge of rage gripped Tom's heart. For a fleeting moment, he thought of lunging at the man, of lashing out with all the pain that now consumed him. But deep down, he knew it would be futile. Nothing could bring Bailey back. No amount of fury could undo the damage that had been done. Swallowing his grief, he forced himself to stand, his legs trembling as he moved to stand between the man and Bailey's lifeless body. You're not leaving until you tell me everything, Tom demanded, his voice dangerously low. I need to know why? Why Bailey? Why me? For the first time, the man seemed to hesitate, glancing down at Bailey's body before meeting Tom's gaze again. You want the truth? He asked, his tone almost indifferent. Tom's jaw tightened as he nodded. Yes. The man sighed, and for a brief moment, his cold exterior seemed to soften, ever so slightly. Bailey was one of the chosen few, he began. Dogs like her, strong, loyal, intelligent, are perfect candidates for integration with forces beyond what you could ever imagine. Tom blinked, stunned. Otherworldly forces? The man stood silently, watching, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke again, his tone softened, if only slightly. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, almost as if it were a formality. But you should know, Bailey was one of the strongest we've ever encountered. She saved you, Tom. She saved you from something far worse. Tom didn't respond. His body shook, consumed by the weight of his sorrow. He barely registered the sound of the man's footsteps as he turned to leave, his steps echoing hollowly in the wrecked silence of the house. Just before stepping out of the front door, the man paused, glancing back at Tom one last time. Take care of yourself, Tom, he said softly. You've endured more than most could bear, but you'll survive this. Bailey would want you to. And with that, the man vanished into the night, leaving Tom alone in the shattered remains of his life, cradling the body of the dog who had given everything for him. As the hours passed, Tom sat in the wreckage of his once peaceful home, holding Bailey close, the only source of warmth now a fading memory. The future was unknown, terrifying, but one truth stood clear. Bailey had fought for him, and Tom would spend the rest of his life honoring her sacrifice. But as the night deepened and shadows crept into every corner, a question clawed at the back of Tom's mind. A question he couldn't ignore. If Bailey had been chosen, how many others were out there? How many were still fighting or, worse, had already lost? And what would happen when the next experiment began? Tom knelt beside Bailey, time slipping away as he remained there, the cold settling deep into his bones. His mind struggled to grasp the enormity of what had happened, the horror of it all. His loyal companion, the dog who had stood by his side through every hardship, had been part of a dark, unfathomable experiment, one that had robbed her of life, twisting her in ways he could barely understand. Tom's breath caught as he gently stroked Bailey's fur, his fingers trembling as the weight of her absence settled in. This couldn't be the end. Couldn't be. The sadness in his chest gripped his heart with an unrelenting force, suffocating and sharp, but underneath the grief lay something darker. A smoldering ember of rage that refused to be extinguished. That man, whoever he was, had orchestrated this horror, and Bailey, his sweet, loyal Bailey, had paid the price. The man's final words echoed in Tom's mind. More experiments. A chill ran down his spine as the realization took root, the possibility that other dogs, or worse people, could be suffering through the same nightmare. His fists clenched, his knuckles turning white as anger surged through him. He couldn't just sit here. He wouldn't. Bailey wouldn't have wanted that. Slowly, Tom rose to his feet, still unsteady, his body worn from adrenaline and grief. He wiped the tears from his face with the back of his hand, his jaw setting in a new resolve. If that man was part of some larger operation, then this wasn't over. Not yet. He needed answers. He needed to know where these experiments were taking place, how they had chosen Bailey. And he had to ensure that no other creature suffered the same fate. Tom stood over Bailey's lifeless body, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He couldn't just leave her like this. Not here, not now. There had to be some way to honor her, to give her the farewell she deserved. With a heavy heart, he gently reached down, lifting her into his arms. Bailey, once so full of life and strength, now felt alarmingly light, as though the spirit that had defined her had been stolen along with her life. The house around him was eerily silent, broken only by the sound of shattered glass crunching under his boots as he carried her to the backyard. Each step felt like an eternity, the world around him seeming to fade into a muted blur. He had no shovel, no tools to dig a proper grave, but there was a patch of earth beneath the old oak tree at the far end of the yard, a place where Bailey had often lay on sunny afternoons, her favorite spot. That spot beneath the old oak tree, where Bailey loved to lay on sunny afternoons, felt like the only fitting place for her to rest. Tom decided then and there that it was where he would bury her. It was the least he could do for the friend who had given him everything. Kneeling down, he gently placed Bailey beneath the tree, his hands lingering on her side. He didn't have the strength for words, not yet. Instead, he sat in silence, the cold night air pressing down as he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his loss, letting it settle in his chest with a crushing finality. But beneath the grief, another feeling simmered, refusing to let him rest. The man's words echoed in his mind, the hints and implications he dropped pointing to something much darker and larger than Tom could have imagined. Tom had always seen his life as ordinary, simple even. But now, he realized he was entangled in something sinister, something that stretched beyond just Bailey. If what the man had said was true, then more dogs, and perhaps even people, were at risk, and he couldn't let that happen. He owed it to Bailey to find the truth, even if the path ahead was one he was unprepared to face. Slowly, Tom rose to his feet, the weight of his purpose settling heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't an investigator or a hero, but he owed it to Bailey to see this through, to get answers. His mind spun with questions. What exactly had Bailey been a part of? How long had they been watching her? Watching him? And, most importantly, where could he even begin to look for answers? His eyes drifted to the mess scattered across the floor, the remnants of the man's presence, left behind in his haste. Papers, files, strange devices all lay strewn about, promising clues to the nightmare Tom now found himself caught in. Kneeling, he sifted through the documents, his pulse quickening as certain words leapt out at him. Integration, vessel, Phase 2. He frowned. Phase 2? This suggested there was more, that whatever they had planned was far from over. More lives were in jeopardy. His resolve solidified. Tom quickly gathered up the papers and set them on the kitchen table, his heart racing as he scanned the information. There were addresses scribbled in the margins, most of them crossed out, but one remained, a location a few towns over. A surge of determination ignited within him. He was going to get to the bottom of this. Just then, the phone rang, slicing through the eerie silence of the house. Tom's heart leapt, a chill racing down his spine. He didn't recognize the number, and every instinct told him not to answer. Could be anyone. Or worse, him. But something deep inside urged him to lift the receiver. Hello? Tom's voice was cautious, his heart pounding as he awaited a response. A long silence followed, stretching out until his fingers tightened around the receiver. And then, finally, he heard it. A soft, almost mechanical voice, dripping with cold menace. A cold, almost mechanical voice crackled on the other end of the line. You shouldn't have interfered, Tom. Tom's breath caught, his grip on the receiver tightening. It was him, the same cold, detached voice from earlier. A shiver ran down his spine. Bailey is gone because of you? The man continued, his tone growing more menacing with every word. But don't worry, she was just the beginning. Tom's hand clenched around the phone, fury boiling up inside him. You're not going to get away with this, he said, his voice a low, furious growl. I'll find you, and I'll stop whatever sick thing you're doing. The man let out a small, sinister laugh, a sound that sent chills through Tom's bones. You? Stop us? Oh, Tom, you're already too late. Phase 2 has already begun. But don't worry. Soon enough, you'll understand just how futile your fight is. The line went dead, and Tom slammed the phone down, his heart racing. For a moment, he stood there, his hands trembling with a potent mixture of fear and anger. He didn't know exactly what Phase 2 meant, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to act, and fast. Without hesitation, Tom grabbed his car keys and the documents he'd found. There was no time to waste. Whoever these people were, whatever plans they had, he was going to stop them. Bailey had died protecting him, fighting for him. Now it was his turn to fight back. He might not know where this path would lead, but he knew one thing. He wouldn't stop until he had answers, and he wouldn't let Bailey's death be in vain. As he pulled out of the driveway and onto the dark, deserted road, Tom cast one last glance at the oak tree in his backyard. Bailey had always been his protector, his guardian, and now, even in death, she was urging him to be stronger, braver. The road ahead was long, and he knew the dangers were real. But Tom was no longer the man he had been just hours ago. His quiet suburban life was gone, replaced by a mission, a purpose. And as he drove into the night, a single fiery thought consumed his mind. They took Bailey from me. Now I'm going to take everything from them. Tom had no idea that the journey he was beginning would plunge him into the darkest recesses of the human mind, and beyond. The strange forces that had claimed Bailey weren't finished, and his role in the unfolding nightmare was just beginning. But as he drove into the depths of the night, there was one thing he knew for certain. He wasn't alone. Bailey's spirit was with him, her presence a steady guide, her loyalty a fierce protector. Together, they would face whatever horrors lay ahead. He drove for what felt like hours, his mind racing with questions, his heart heavy with a potent mix of grief and unrelenting resolve. The documents in the passenger seat were his only clue, but he clung to them like a lifeline, each word a piece of a terrible puzzle. An address scribbled on one of the papers pointed to a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place buried in shadows and secrecy. It was the perfect hiding spot for something sinister. Tom parked a safe distance away, sitting for a moment in the stillness of his car, gathering his thoughts. The man's chilling words replayed in his mind. Phase 2 has already begun. The meaning eluded him, but it gnawed at him, driving him forward. He couldn't help but wonder how many more innocent creatures, like Bailey, were suffering in this nightmare. His hand instinctively rested on the spot beside him, where Bailey had always sat, her comforting presence now a painful absence. The silence in the car was deafening without her steady companionship. Taking a deep breath, he shook off the sorrow, focusing on what he needed to do. This was for Bailey. He had to see this through. Moving silently, he crept toward the warehouse, using the cover of night to his advantage. The building appeared abandoned, its structure old and rusted, but faint lights flickered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Someone was inside. Tom found a side entrance, the lock old and rusty, easy to pry open. As he slipped inside, his senses sharpened, going on high alert. The dimly lit interior was dark and industrial, the faint hum of machinery echoing through the stillness. Tom's pulse quickened as he moved through the winding corridors, guided by the faint glow of light and the low murmur of voices. He paused, listening, as fragments of their conversation floated toward him, sending a sickening chill down his spine. "I told you," one voice muttered in frustration. "The integration process needs to be slower. We can't afford another failure like Bailey." Tom froze, his blood running cold at the mention of his dog's name. His heart thundered in his chest as he strained to listen. "The vessel was too strong-willed," another voice replied, calm and calculating. "It resisted the entity. We underestimated the bond with its owner." Tom's heart pounded painfully as realization hit him. They were talking about Bailey. His mind swirled with anger, grief, and a fierce resolve. They had stolen her from him, and whatever they had planned, he was going to put an end to it. They were talking about Bailey, about what they had done to her. A surge of fury swelled in Tom's chest, almost overwhelming him, but he forced himself to remain calm. He couldn't afford to charge in recklessly, not yet. He needed more information, more proof, if he was going to put an end to this horror once and for all. As Tom crept closer, the corridor opened up into a large, sterile room filled with cages. His heart sank as he took in the sight. Animals of every kind, each one trapped behind metal bars, their eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. The silence was haunting, the animals too frightened to make a sound. Tom's heart ached at the sight. These creatures were waiting for the same unspeakable fate that had been forced upon Bailey. In the center of the room, two men stood in lab coats, one holding a clipboard, the other adjusting a strange, glowing device, similar to the one Tom had seen the night Bailey had died. His stomach twisted as he realized he was standing in the very heart of the nightmare that had torn his life apart. "We move on to the next subject tomorrow," one of the men said, his tone casual, as if he were discussing a routine task. "This one should be more compliant." Tom's hands balled into fists, rage thrumming through him. He couldn't let this continue. But he was only one man, unarmed, facing what was clearly a well-organized, deeply sinister operation. He needed a plan, some way to tip the scales in his favor. Taking a deep breath, he stepped back into the shadows, scanning the room for anything he could use. His gaze settled on a fire alarm near the exit. It was a risk, but it might be his only shot. If he could create enough chaos, maybe he could free the animals and destroy their equipment in the confusion. Tom crept toward the alarm, each step slow and deliberate, his heart pounding in his chest. His fingers wrapped around the handle, steadying himself, and in one swift motion, he pulled it down. As Tom yanked the fire alarm, the piercing sound tore through the warehouse, shattering the eerie silence. The men in lab coats whipped their heads up, their eyes wide with confusion, scanning the room for the source of the noise. But Tom didn't waste a second on them. He bolted toward the cages, frantically unlocking each one. "Go! Get out!" he urged, his voice barely audible over the blaring alarm. The animals, sensing their chance at freedom, scrambled out, their paws skittering across the cold concrete floor as they dashed toward the exits. Tom worked quickly, his hands shaking with adrenaline as he freed each one. He knew he had only moments before the men realized what was happening, but he wouldn't leave until every last animal was free. As the final cage swung open, Tom heard footsteps pounding toward him. He spun around just in time to see one of the men charging at him, his face twisted in fury. "You!" the man shouted, his eyes narrowing with rage. "You're the one who—" Before he could finish, Tom swung a metal pipe he had grabbed from the floor, connecting with the man's temple and sending him crashing to the ground, unconscious. Breathing heavily, Tom glanced around, looking for any sign of the other man. But he was gone. Likely fled, taking whatever secrets this dark operation held with him. Tom knew he didn't have much time. He rushed to the center of the room, where the strange, glowing device still sat on the table. He didn't fully understand what it was or how it worked, but he knew one thing. This device was responsible for the nightmare that had taken Bailey's life, for turning his beloved dog into something unrecognizable. and now he would destroy it. With every ounce of strength he could muster, Tom lifted the device and hurled it to the ground. The metal casing cracked, and a burst of light shot out, flickering wildly before finally sputtering out. The ominous hum that had filled the room vanished, leaving only the relentless blare of the fire alarm echoing through the silence. Tom's chest heaved as he stood over the shattered remains of the device, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was done. Whatever they had used to torment these innocent animals was gone, destroyed. But he knew this was only one piece of a much larger operation. The man had escaped, and Tom knew there were likely others involved, scattered across who knew how many locations. For now, though, the animals were safe. For now, Bailey had been avenged. As Tom made his way toward the exit, the freed animals followed him like a parade of survivors. He felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The pain of losing Bailey still weighed heavily on his heart, but at least now, he knew her death hadn't been in vain. Stepping out into the cold night air, he watched the animals scatter, disappearing into the safety of the surrounding woods. Tom stood there for a long moment, breathing in the night air, gazing up at the stars scattered across the sky. He had made a difference tonight, even if only for a few lives. But just as he turned to leave, a noise behind him caught his attention. He spun around, his heart pounding. Tom's heart skipped a beat as he noticed a lone dog standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him with intense, piercing eyes. It wasn't Bailey, he knew that, but there was something in the dog's gaze that felt familiar, almost comforting, as though Bailey's spirit lingered close. The dog tilted its head slightly, a quiet acknowledgement, before it turned and trotted off into the woods. Tom stood there for a long while, his gaze following the dog until it disappeared into the shadows. A strange sense of connection washed over him, an unspoken understanding that Bailey was still with him, in spirit, in memory, and in every step he would take from this moment on. The nightmare he'd uncovered was far from over. He knew there were still people out there conducting these twisted experiments, more dangers hidden in the shadows. But Tom wasn't afraid anymore. He had faced the darkness and come out on the other side. And as he turned away from the warehouse, the distant echo of the alarm fading behind him, he felt a renewed strength inside. He would keep fighting just as Bailey had. For her, for the animals, and for the people who had no idea what horrors lay hidden in the dark. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel and like this video. We release a brand new video every day, so stay tuned to this space. We invite you to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care, and see you in the next video.